Okay, welcome everybody then to another session. My name is Uwe Pohl, and as you've just been told, I work here at Witwatersrand University in the School of English and American Studies in the Department of English Language Pedagogy. But I actually really, I've just looked at the people participating. I think we are people from 14 countries, and plus the presenters. And I think it would be really nice if, just to begin with, we could say hello in all our languages. I can see that you have the chat open. It's been used quite happily, so that's great. I would suggest for a moment that you use the chat. And here's just a glimpse, but I know there's so many more out there of you. If you could just say in the chat, in your language, hello everybody. I'll just give you a moment to do that and we'll see what we get in the chat. Just getting out of the chat for a moment to see, because I couldn't see very well. That's looking good. Nice. Thank you very much. As I've said, I actually work, I'm a little bit of an odd one out here with you in the company of practitioners of teaching Chinese as a foreign language and specialists in that field. Because I teach and I train related to English as a foreign language. And although I've worked with Chinese teachers of English as a foreign language and with lecturers who work at universities where they teach through English, I don't speak Chinese. But I think there are a number of things that we actually share as people who care deeply, I think, about the languages that we teach and about education in general. And I thought this morning I'd like to speak to you to some of the shared concerns that I believe we have, and I'd like to see whether they resonate with you. Now, if you allow me, I think one thing that we have in common at this time is that we all brought a concern or a worry with us that might be sitting there right at the back of our minds. So I'm just wondering whether you have a concern or a worry that you brought along with you this morning. I have one. My daughter, who lives in Vienna now, she's still teaching at school. So obviously, you know, the situation in Vienna is as bad as in many other places. So I'm concerned about that. But for the time being, I want to put this concern into the cloakroom, simply to be here with you, fully focused. And I would just invite you to do the same. So if you have some sort of concern, it could be a worry, it could be something about not feeling well, it could be something that you still need to do. Could you just, again, use the chat and to put your worry there? And it'll be there. It's really important. You can return to it after this talk or at the end of the day. So for now, I give you just a couple of minutes to think about what there is that's sort of nagging you maybe at the back of your mind, and then put it into the cloakroom, which is now the chat. Just wondering if anybody's writing anything. Reaction of students, I can see something there. Probably some of the concerns are there. They're not actually, I wouldn't be able to read them. You might be writing them not in English. So just scrolling a little bit. Okay. Let me get back to my screen then. So the topic of my talk is engaging language learners online. And there are a number of reasons why I chose this topic for your webinar. I think, like most teachers at this time, I've been in a learning process for almost a year now. And it's been a pretty steep learning curve, a big one. And basically, there have been two questions that kept me busy. One of them is, how can I do what I usually do as a language teacher and a trainer in the new world of online teaching? There are things that I know are important, but how do I do them now with the new tools, some of which I'm still learning to use fully, in the new world of my students facing me very differently? And the second question is, what do I need to change? What do I need to learn for the benefits of my students? So preparing for this talk has been very much a kind of stock-taking opportunity for me. So what do I know now about how to realize some key principles of what language teaching online means to me? And I want to talk about basically four things. I think it's important to spend a little bit of time talking or thinking about what engagement actually is and why it matters, particularly at this time in the new and challenging world of online teaching. The other 3 points sort of follow naturally because they are more practical in nature, because they are to do, on the one hand, with how to get things started online. We have now moved into a virtual reality that for a long time, I think at least my generation was sort of just viewing from the outside in most of the time. But getting our classes started is something that I've known for a long time. I'm pretty good at it, but it's been a bit of a challenge to find what's been called virtual relating ways in order for these classes to get off on the right foot, as it were. I've also always been a great believer in reviewing learning material. Students don't just learn by being taught by us. They need to review, and they need to review with our help, and they need to review with each other. So how do you do that in the virtual space? And what does interactive reviewing mean? And finally, I'd like to share a few things about how to keep students engaged. Just having them engaged doesn't mean that they stay engaged. And that highlights the importance of finding task types that are mainly interactive in some form to ensure that kind of engagement. I think I said at the beginning that this would be a talk, but I would feel really odd if a talk about engagement of students online was not a little engaging itself. And I usually use Zoom or Teams, and I was happy to see that Teams now has breakout rooms. Unfortunately, this version doesn't, so I had to change my ideas for this morning a little bit. But while I want this to be very much a show and tell talk, I will here and there, just like with the cloakroom, make it just a little bit engaging, to invite you to get engaged. And probably that means using the chat function most of the time. So I need your help with your engagement there. I also said at the beginning that I'm no specialist when it comes to teaching Chinese as a foreign language, but I do know something about second language learning. And I thought it might be useful to remind ourselves of some of the key things that we now know when second language learning happens. And let me just take you around those very briefly. I think we would all agree that motivation is key. It matters what motivates our students to learn Chinese or English or any other language for that matter, or whether indeed they are motivated at all. We need sufficient exposure to the language, and luckily these days, both in the case of Chinese and English, there is so much language available online through the media, so that side of exposure is fine. But we still have to make sure there's enough exposure, living language used in our classrooms. That gets us to engagement, really, because engagement really is about, it's sort of the meeting point between content, that's the language, and the learners. And it is for us to use tasks, activities that make this meeting point productive so that learners pick up or engage with language. There is also a double meaning, though, to engagement, which is just as important here and particularly important for me today. And that is that learners don't just engage with the material, they engage with the teacher and they engage with the students. And I'll come back to that several times this morning. Beyond what happens in the classroom, we also know that in the long term, learners will only learn if they can use what they've learned in some sense. What that might be in the case of Chinese, I don't know, whether it's work related or, you know, socializing, traveling, I'm not sure. But it is key that they sense and they have opportunities to use the language that they're learning and they've learned beyond the actual teaching. And finally, feedback is important too. This is a process, language learning, and learners will need some sort of sense of how well they are progressing. They need it and they expect it from us. So let's then home in on engagement, because that is the main focus of my talk this morning. Why is student engagement, why do I believe that student engagement is particularly crucial at this time? I think if you are within the paradigm of teaching communicatively, you would agree that engagement means to create opportunities for communication. Somebody put this rather nicely once and said that for students to learn to communicate in a language, they need to communicate. So a good part of what we do in our classrooms has to be communication, learner communication. Now that gets us right to the question of student engagement as a form of participation or involvement. If you've done any online teaching these past few months, I'm sure you will have experienced what I've experienced, that this is even harder to achieve than in face-to-face instruction. And finally, is something that I feel particularly strongly about, and it's sometimes overlooked. When our learners come together in our classes, because most of us, I think, are dealing with groups of learners, then they bring to this group setting a particular kind of energy. You could say a personal energy, and that creates a group energy. The reason for that is that teaching is a pedagogic encounter, but it is also a social encounter. So here the question then is, how do I tap into this potential of group energy to make it work for me as part and parcel of the teaching process? I'm hoping that this is particularly appreciated by you, because you are people who know a lot and appreciate Chinese language and culture. And I've always found the notion of qi very intriguing and useful, not just as an analogy, but particularly as regards the last point, the idea that, you know, all living things go through cycles of birth and decay, ever changing. And I've sort of been trying to bring this notion into the way that I think about teaching and the way I think about planning classes and in the way that I relate to my students in the moment of teaching. So if we just stay with this for a moment, and let's say we plot a class in terms of the kind of energy that we can feel at any one time, and those of you who are practitioners of Chinese teaching will be able to relate to this, I'm sure. Then you would probably agree with me and say that this class, which has been very low on the kind of energy that could be felt, sort of a flatliner, probably wasn't a particularly good class. And ideally, an energetic class would have a bit like the notion of qi, a build-up, a climax, and a sort of relaxation celebration, because you cannot climax all the time. You cannot be engaged fully all the time. So I think in more real terms, most of our classes will follow more of a pattern that you see here, sort of wavy change from a small build-up, a relaxation period, another build-up, a relaxation period, if they go well. So maybe then we can look a little bit at what engagement actually means or how it's understood, because there are, as always, different definitions or ways of looking at engagement. I think the simplest way of putting it might be engagement is active participation and student involvement. But if we look a little bit more closely, then we will realize it's actually more than that, or rather we need to be more precise. So engagement is actually not a state, but a process. And what psychologists teach us about this, or tell us, is that engagement actually starts with the moment we are entering the class, and actually before we start teaching, because the first point is there has to be a willingness on the learner's side to engage. That's very much related to motivation, but perhaps more to do with the intrinsic side of motivation, making learners wanting to take part, wanting to be engaged and involved. And we need to give some thought to how to do that, because that leads us to, as engagement doesn't just sort of pop up or happen, how can we trigger it? What is it that we can actually do? Now, I have found that, particularly because of the situation we're all in, and because of the medium, these first two are not easy to achieve. And even if we have achieved them, the question remains how we keep students engaged or return to forms of engagement in that kind of wavy curve that I've just shown you. So this takes me now to the different ways in which I have been trying to, first of all, get started in a way that is appropriate to what I see is happening in the virtual world. And the term that I find very useful here is called virtual relating. And virtual relating is not sort of a touchy-feely icing on the cake sort of way of starting our classes, but it is really about a kind of conscious attunement to the students from me as a teacher, and from the students to me and to the others in the group. It's in a way also about sort of creating a group coherence from a two-dimensional screen, a kind of syncing of the minds of the students to what we're about to do and to the group that they're part of. Attention is part of this, and we all know attention is a limited resource. And in this world in particular, we are kind of competing with others for attention. So we need to kind of steal our learners' attention as part of the triggering, a little bit like advertisers do, actually, when you think about it. And I've started off with you on the cloakroom because more often than not, my students are actually not present, not mentally there in the online classes. In the current situation, particularly because they are worried about certain things. Their loved ones, about what's going to happen to their work, university, grades. Some are just in love, which is also a concern as they're young. And so virtual relating would need to take care of that, to create sort of a shared space that's warm, hence the fire, and safe at the same time. So how have I been trying to do this? Well, if I want to acknowledge where my students are and the fact that they may not be feeling good, I've actually always set some time aside at the beginning by asking, how are you feeling today? Now, there are a number of ways of doing this. If you want to make it a little bit language rich, my students write in the chat, which is also a safe way of doing it. Not very good, horrible, I'm okay. Actually, I'm fine. Okay. I may or may not go there, or I may send them straight to the cloakroom and just suggest that for the time being, they put the negative feelings elsewhere. An alternative is, and if you are familiar with Zoom or Teams, you will know that you can use a whiteboard and invite the students actually to draw. So I asked my students, for example, how are you feeling today? And those who enjoy this, a couple of them did a bit of a drawing. I wonder what you think, how this cat is feeling. And then students start brainstorming words. Not sure, uncertain, perhaps distracted. Yeah. So I can actually tweak it. I can change how much of this I want to happen and how it could happen through a very simple use of the tools that are available to us now. Now, a different way, or let me just say, so the point is that I want to acknowledge where the students are, but I want them then to move on to starting the session productively. And if I can, to already bring in forms of engagement and interaction that are key to a language learning class. So one of the things I've done, and I would do this with you now, but as you don't have breakout rooms, I cannot do it, so I would just tell you, is to choose a picture. And somebody already commented that they like the dog. That's a favorite. But the task is simply, which picture speaks to you at this moment and why? So once they're in the breakout room, they will share, I've chosen, let's say D. One student says, because I'm playing my instrument a lot more. I don't play the guitar, but I play an instrument. Actually, just read some really interesting research. It seems it's one of the positive outcomes of the COVID era that that people in general are returning to learning instruments or picking up instruments they haven't touched for a long time. So maybe a student might pick up on that one, or the dog because they're wishing they would be out there somewhere, or maybe the spiral staircase because it's something that they're not sure about where this is going. Are we going up or are we going down? So this is something they could discuss. Or I would simply say, choose a picture that speaks to you and put it in the chat. Now, I'm not going to switch off my slide now, but I would invite you to do that. So I'm just curious what you would write. Can you in the chat write which picture speaks to you? You just write the letter for now, B, C, D, E, or F. I'll give you a moment or two to do so. Actually, while you're doing this, perhaps it's also where we're thinking about that one of the things that starts happening, which has a bearing on engagement, is the time passes differently online. And as you set things up and as you wait for students to respond to a task or get into a breakout room, I think the notion of how you plan your classes has to change. So for me, this means, for example, less will be more. I plan much less than I normally would have, taking into account that this kind of latching on and switching off is part and parcel of the online teaching world. Okay, and a final way, a simple way, that I've used many times with different students now is as part of creating a positive, a productive trigger. I invite the students to come to class bringing something. So it could be their favorite piece of clothing, for example. Some classes just people come with blue, where if their jewelry is blue, their jumpers are blue, somebody brings a scarf, somebody else brings a shirt or t-shirt that they love, and it already changes the atmosphere. Alternatively, if you want to keep it very simple, this is my favorite mug with that little knitted bit to keep my hands safe from a hot cup. And students just bring their cup, we show them at the beginning. That doesn't take much time, but I have found it has a profound impact on how students are willing to get started. So you may remember that I said one of the reasons why engagement is so important to me now has to do with the energy that I want to create, that I want to be positive, and that I want to be able to feel even though I'm looking at the screen. An interesting conceptualization that I have found useful and I would like to share with you is the following by Peter Senge, because he says basically there are two types of groups in an educational process. And one of them is he calls non-aligned. And he says, and in a non-aligned group, energy is wasted. And what he means by that is this. What you see in the box, you see the arrows. Each arrow is a student. And if we do not manage the flow of energy, if we do not align the group mentally, emotionally, perhaps as well, these students are on a different planet. As I mentioned before, one of them might be in love, one of them might be ill, another might be worried, another about a next test they've got to do, and so on. So we need to think about how we align these students and their energies to get a common sense of direction. He calls it, which I like a lot, harmonizing the individual energies to have a kind of an aligned group energy. And it's a little bit like, if you look for an analogy, you know, the way birds fly in formation. They're very efficient flyers because they have the arrow formation. It gives them a clear sense of direction, and they're economical in the use of their energy. And I think in a way that is very close to what we think good teaching should be about. So that takes me actually to the notion of interactive reviewing. And as I've said, when students engage with material and they do so in our classes, they still haven't learned the material. Now, there are different ways in which they might do that, but I find that the classroom too, particularly somewhere still towards the beginning of my classes, reviewing is in order. And if I want to create the kind of engagement I want and the kind of communication that I want in the target language, then I look for ways of doing this interactively. Now, again, I'm sorry if I come back to energy, but it's interesting to see that most of the energy that we get, even intuitively, you will agree, is created through interaction. The moment you talk to someone, you do something with a person, you get an energy flow. even if the seating is not necessarily the best one for this, and even if it's online. But it's difficult online because, as one of my students once said, you know, it's a bit like you're sitting in a shop window, quite exposed. And the usual way of leaning in, what I think Trevor Bentley would call as his way of defining energy, that the physical vitality of interaction is lost a little bit. So if I now had time, I would do what I always do at the beginning of my classes. I would choose something for students to talk about. I was planning to give you a moment to actually share something in the breakout. We're not going to do that now, but I would encourage you, if you haven't yet, to use the breakout rooms. Students really come to appreciate them. It feels a little bit odd to be in them initially, but they appreciate them over time for two reasons. One, it's because they are actually in a small space. It's very different from being, you know, with another 15, 16 or way more students. So there's a certain intimacy to the breakout room. And they can talk to different people different times. So it's very easy to mix the composition of the breakout rooms too. And they did appreciate the fact that, for the reasons I mentioned, that the room is more special, more personal. At least in Zoom, you can also enter the breakout room as a teacher. You can listen in or take part in the communication, which makes the whole setup a lot more real or authentic. Now, but reviewing can happen in much simpler words. And I'm just wondering, if I did a little review with you now, whether you remember two words that I've mentioned before when I talked about energy and groups, and something that happened at the beginning. So I'm not going to leave the slide now, but again, in the chat, just for you, I would suggest that you write down these two words if you remember them. Again, I'll give you a moment. So in this case, I just chose two words that relate to what I've been talking about, but obviously in your Chinese, teaching Chinese as a foreign language context, it could be any words that are important as part of what you've been teaching, in order to help students remember them. And so the two things were an aligned group and a cloak room. So I couldn't see what you were writing. I hope some of you were writing something. A different way, again, a simple way of reviewing interactively is what I've called secret word and secret message. So secret word, again, I'm inviting you to do the following, is this, that you see here a word beginning, whoops, I think I left the share, just a second. And you see here the lines stand for all the letters in the word. And one of the letters is a T. I don't know, you're probably all muted, but again, I wonder if you... So what I would normally do is I would say, can you give me a letter? And if that letter is part of the word, I will add it where it belongs. And over time, students would add the letters, and at some point somebody would say, I think the word was the following. Virtual. So a word that was important to what we've been doing so far. The secret message version of this is that I actually send the word as a message to one of the students, and the student has to explain the word, and the other students will have to guess what the word or the words were. So this is a simple way of reviewing interactively. Now, finally, I said that students will not remain engaged. And so we need to think of interactive task types, different ones for a class, to get their engagement back. So what I've said here about, or shown at the beginning about the energy level, you could also replace by attention. Bentley, in his definition of energy, actually mentions mental intensity and vitality as a key aspect of group energy. And really, mental has very much to do with the ability of students to attend to what's going on and to engage. Now, we're having a bit of a problem, though. Even before we had to move into the online world, our learners now, and we ourselves in many ways, as the image shows, are experiencing a new phenomenon, and Linda Stone called it continuous partial attention. This is now very much the norm in many of our countries. And continuous partial attention means we are not fully paying attention all of the time. Now that is important because it's limiting our ability to focus and to listen in real time, in face-to-face, but also online. So our ability to pay attention to what's going on and to those around us is compromised. And we need to take that into account. And if you've done online teaching, you might have seen signs of this as students are looking elsewhere. Maybe if you have, it's an issue, even if you can see that, if they have the cameras on, to somehow take into account that their attention spans are relatively short, and you need to think about what it is that would get the attention back. Now, related to this comes the added difficulty I have found that a lot of time is often wasted because students, when asked to volunteer, will not volunteer. And nominating them by name is not the same thing. So one way in which I have found it really useful to nominate in a personal and a more fun way is to use something like the Wheel of Names. And for this, I will go out of the share for a moment and to share with you, if you allow me, the actual site. So I think you can see this now. And it's a very simple way of working, and it's a fast one because you can cut and paste your students' names into the Enter Names section on the right. And once they're there, you can set the spin to very quick, let's say 5 seconds, and you get a student. No protests, and they can. And each time you close, one name is removed, so students can't hide. There's always somebody new, and you may not want to get into a pattern that always the same people speak or say something. This is also a very nice little tool to use from the point of view of, choosing topics, because you can put names here, but of course you could also put different topics or words here, a whole word list, and to turn it around, which word gets chosen, and you can still, if you want, nominate a student to say what the word is, give a definition, use it in the sentence, and so on. Okay. Let me go back to my screen now. Now, another way of engaging and keeping engagement high over a certain period of time is to work less individually and more with the focus on the whole group. I think it's one of the things that I've realized, and if you remember, we had 3 issues to do with engagement, and the first one is a willingness to engage, the second one was a trigger, and the third one was to keep them engaged. And the issue of or the advantage of a group challenge means that people don't feel exposed individually so much. You invite the group and you invite individuals in the group to help each other do something in the language. Now, one such technique is called sentence expansion, and I must admit, because I don't speak Chinese, I'm not sure how well this could be done in Chinese, but with my students, I would invite them to say, I like Chinese. Can you add a word anywhere before I, or like, or after I, or after Chinese? And over time, one student, one word, we build up a meaningful grammatical sentence, which might be something like, normally I really like wonderful, tasty Chinese cookies, or something like that. So the responsibility here for working with the language is shared, and I'm not sure how well that would work with Chinese, which is a very different language, but the idea of inviting students to work and do a task jointly is I have found works really well to get everybody involved and not just a few individuals who are willing to participate. One key tool that we have, particularly with learners whose language level is already a little higher, is to have a discussion. I've shown the teacher desk icon at the top. In many of our classrooms, we still have a problem that really the classroom setting does not lend itself well to a good discussion. But in many ways now, we are having the same situation because students are sitting in rows, in little tiles on our computer screens. Now, there is a technique which I've been using quite happily to get around this sometimes, and it's called a fishbowl discussion. In face-to-face, you can see how this works. There's a circle of students. It doesn't have to be that many. It could be just 3 or 4 who start discussing a particular feature, and the students around them looking into the fishbowl have to follow, because at some point they will be invited to join the circle. So again, the idea is that while some people are more active in terms of communication, everybody is active paying attention. So joining the circle could happen by somebody getting nominated. Let's say a person stands up and taps somebody in the back on the shoulder, and they change places with each other. One goes in the circle, another one becomes an observer. Or the teacher could nominate. So the reason why I've found this actually works rather well online is that you can play around with the cameras. Now, this implies that you encourage your students to have your cameras on. I do. I cannot force them for all sorts of reasons, but over time they get used to having their cameras on as a key part of communication. And if they do, I can create a fishbowl in the very way that you're seeing here, that everybody who is part of the inner part of the fishbowl keeps the camera on. Everybody else switches it off, but they can't switch off paying attention because they may have to join the circle at a certain time, either nominated by someone, they could send a chat message, or by me sending a chat message saying, I would like you to switch with, and I give the name of the student. Okay. So again, it's a way of involving the whole group, keeping it communicative, and keeping everybody engaged. If I'd had some time, I would have perhaps done this with you in some sort of format. I don't, but I would say that a good way, I would say even with something like the fishbowl, students may need a little bit of a push to actually get into discussion mode. So normally what I do is I use another technique, which I have used always face-to-face, which is to form an opinion line. So if you have a topic that's closer to you and me, strict teachers are more effective than lenient teachers, which actually might be a nice one to discuss for students as well. I first ask them to decide whether they agree with the statement or they disagree. Now, there are different ways in which they can respond. Now, I would invite you to do this with a chat again. I will not leave my slides now, even if I can't see the chat, but I would like you to put an A into the chat if you agree that strict teachers are more effective than lenient teachers, and a D if you disagree with the statement. So an alternative way of working with this is that if you know Zoom and if you know Teams, you know that there's a whiteboard. So you can actually have an opinion line there, and students can make a cross or put in a symbol along the continuum, because there may be some who say, well, it's not so easy. I would be sort of in the middle. And you can see very nicely how the opinions are distributed along the opinion line. That is important for two reasons. Number one, you want an online discussion starter, which, you know, kind of gives a little bit of startup energy, a jump start to the discussion. And an opinion line does that. The second reason is if you see the distribution of students, if you say have 16 students along the continuum, you can create the breakout rooms not at random, but you put students together who disagreed and who agreed, so that there's much more engagement and interactive potential if the groups are not people who hold the same opinion, but who perhaps disagree. So that itself will be a stimulus to having a good discussion. Okay. What I shall leave you with is just a quick look at an article that's just come out, which I wrote with a colleague. If you're interested in interactive work modes that you can consider for working both face-to-face and online, it might be an interesting article for you to read. In fact, I could share it with you in the chat when I'm finished in a minute. And here are a couple of sources that I have used in my talk just now. I've chosen some that actually have an online link, so they might be easier for you to access if you're interested in them. And I would like to say thank you for your attention, and stay safe wherever you are, and all the best for the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.